Hey guys, so in this lecture we are going to see a little bit about rendering or how we can render things, how we can handle state, and what are the good practices when handling components. So let's just quickly get started. So let me just comment this app. So when you go into the rendering section, I'll just comment this. Don't worry, I'll revert everything, but I just want to showcase something very nice and tidy out here. So let me just do that. So let's say I have a function tick, which pretty much does is it ticks every second, and you have an element that you create. Let's say that element has a div, closing div. It has an h1 saying hello world. It closes the h1. It has a h2 which just displays the current time. The current time is, and it will give us something. Now that's our element. So to render a component, you can use a React DOM dot render, and then you pass in the component that you need to render, which is the first element. In this case, we are not rendering a component, but we are rendering this element. So we'll just do an element, comma, and the next is where you want to replace the element by. So just say get element by ID root, and this should save it. It should just render something, which is a new, and it should refresh. And there's a problem because I put in a quote. It should not be a quote. Okay. And to render the tick function, we need to just do a set interval so that it runs every 1000 milliseconds. Let's just save this, and it should compile and it should run as well. And you can see the current time is, and something should happen. Now here, the way we can display the current time is you can do a new date to local time string. Local time string. Let's save it, and it should start displaying the time. Now I just wanted this to be seen by you. The reason being, when you see this and you go and select the element, you will note that everything in the DOM or your HTML remains the same except the time, because that's the only thing that's changing, and that's the power of React, where you only update what needs update. So whatever component needs an update, you only update that component or that element or that tag, but you do not update the rest of your DOM. And that's why React is very powerful, and it is very good from the performance perspective. However, the way we have written this method is not very React friendly, I would say. The reason being, there is obviously a better approach, and the ideal thing would be to convert it to a component, just like we had this app, so we can put it into the app. So let me just remove this and revert back to the app that we had, so that I can go back and code it in our app. Let's try to code the same tick function using the components that we have learned. So how will we do that? Well, it's very simple. So the first thing we need to do is convert the whole function into a component. Just the way we had a header or a footer, we'll convert it to a component. Let me just copy this. Let me create a clock component. Clock component extends this, returns something, and let me remove this. Let me just change the class name because we don't need this class name for now. We don't need a header. We just do a h2. The time is, let's just display the static text and make sure the component works. Save this, and let's try to put it here. Let's see if our text gets displayed. Fantastic, the text gets displayed out here. Now we can add the property where we want to make sure that it's dynamic. So the way we can hold the time, and the time should be very much in this component, which means the tick itself should happen in this component versus the outside the component, or probably in the parent component. So what you can do is you can very well pass in a date, and you can just say new date. So this will become a property to clock, and the new date will be a property, and then that can update the date. That's very well doable. But if that component has to stand independently, you do not do that. What you do instead is you create a constructor, just the way we did for the other method. And in the constructor, what you will do is you will set the state, which is this state, as a new date. Now you have the state set to a new date. You can use this state to display your data. How do you do that? Well, you can use this dot state out here. This dot state dot date dot to local time string and save it. You should start seeing the new date, but it will not tick. Okay, so it's not displaying because I have a typo here. Let me fix this. So it's a locale time string and then it should display the time string. Now I have the time string that gets displayed here, but it's not ticking yet. Well, the reason it's not ticking because we haven't implemented the tick or the set interval function that we had initially. And let's see how that can be implemented or used. Well, before even we get started with the ticking, let me just tell you about the life cycle methods of a class. So when we define it as a class, there are certain life cycle methods that come along with it. So in any application with many components, it's very important to free up resources taken by the components when they are destroyed. So these methods are nothing but the life cycle methods. We want to set up a timer whenever the clock is rendered to the DOM. So whenever the clock element needs to be rendered, we want to set up a timer. Now this is called mounting in React. Similarly, we also want to clear the timer whenever the DOM produced the clock is removed. So whenever this clock is removed from the DOM, which means we no longer need to display the time, the React component needs to be clear or the memory needs to be freed. It's called unmounting in React. Now we can declare special methods on the component class to run some code when a component mounts and unmounts. And what are those methods? Let's see them. So the first one is component did mount, which tells us when a component has mounted. And the second method we have is component. Let me just copy this, and component will. It's not did, but it's will unmount. Okay, so these are the two lifecycle methods that we have on a component or a class that we see because it extends the component. One is mounting and second is unmounting. So component did mount and component will mount. I will talk a little more about these later in the detail, but let's get ahead with the example that we were trying to do, where we can implement the ticking function inside a component did mount. So how do we do that? So what we do is we do a this dot timer, let's say id is equals to set interval, which is a function, and it accepts a function too. Now when it accepts a function, what we can do is we can just use the ES6 version of it. Let me just go to the other line. Let's write the function here, and then the delay is of course 1 second. So in this, what we will try to do is we'll try to implement a this dot tick, and what we will do for tick, we will just write another method here, tick, or another function here, and in this tick function we can write our logic, which is this dot set state, where we are trying to set the state, and what we are trying to set the state is we want to update the date with a new date, which means every second we keep on checking for a new date. So whenever we update the date or whenever we call the tick function, the date needs to be updated. Let me just break it down to a new line so it's easier to understand. Let's just move date and this on the other line. So now what will happen is whenever the component is mounted, you can see the timer started ticking. The component mounted, we set up an interval, we call this function tick, and this function just updates the state, which is set state, and it's again an object, so you can update the date with the new date. Now what will happen in unmount? Unmount is very clear. We just clear the interval and we pass the interval ID. In this scenario, it's going to be time ID, and we can call it a this.timer ID, so that way we have the same timer ID. Everything should work, and only this component should be updating the time. So let me just recap what we did. So we created a clock which is passed to the app, of course, and which is ultimately passed to the React DOM to render, and that's what you see here. Now in this component, what we are trying to do is we have a constructor, so we call the constructor for the clock, And since clock needs to display the current time, it initializes the this state with an object, which is this date, to the current time. And then we will later update this state every second. Then React calls the clock component's render method. So the render method gets called when you hit the component. Now this is how React learns what should be displayed on the screen. React then updates the DOM to match clock's render output, which means it will display this div onto the screen. When the clock output is inserted into the DOM, React calls the component did mount, which means when HTML is put onto the screen, the component did mount function will be called, and that's where your ticker or your interval will be called as well. So the moment your components are mounted, which means the div is on the page, you start the timer. Now when you start the timer, there's a tick function, and the tick function just does is it updates the date to a new date, and this ticker function will be called every 1 second based on the set interval. Now if the clock component is ever removed from the DOM, React calls the component will unmount function, and then it will clear the interval with the ID this.time ID. Sounds fun? So that was your first clock, or probably React component that dynamically updates itself. Now just to be careful, React, when you use React state, you do not modify the state directly. What do I mean by that? So let's say if I have another component or another state here which says comment is equals to, let's say, hello. Now on every tick, let me just display the comment also here. So let's say I display a para and say this dot state dot comment and then a p. This will display hello. Now what I can do is on every tick, I can also update the contents of comment to whatever was the state, which is this dot state dot comment plus, let's say I would say x. I don't know, whatever that will do, but it should start updating. Okay, I forgot the comma. Let me save it. It should display x, and every time this ticks, x will get updated. So when you write something like this, you have an option to do it in this fashion, or what you do is you can also do a this dot state dot comment is equals to hello plus x. So if you see this, the page should refresh and you should start seeing hello x. So both cases will work, but this is not the right approach to go about it. So every time you update a state, you call the set state, because there are many things that happen in parallel. The only place where you assign this state is in the constructor. So make sure you understand that. Now state updates may be asynchronous. React may batch multiple set state, which means if you have a lot of set states happening, React may batch them together into a single update for performance reasons. Because this dot props and this dot state may be updated asynchronously, you should not rely on their values for calculating the next state. So that was all about rendering and how you can manage the state. I hope you have a lot to go over. Make sure you go over it and ask me any questions in the comments or the Q&A section. And of course, I'll always be there to help you. I'll see you in the next class.